Carla Johnson was a decorated army soldier, but behind the uniform she carried secrets darker than anyone imagined. James Johnson, her devoted husband of 2 decades, believed their love was unshakable until a single DNA test uncovered a truth that shattered their home. Their children Ethan, Lily, Sarah, and Noah were caught in the middle of a storm they could never escape. What began as the family's quiet life in Atlanta ended in betrayal, dismemberment, and a manhunt that shocked the entire nation. Carla Davis had always been seen as the picture of stability in her Atlanta neighborhood. 2 neighbors and friends. She was the quiet, organized wife of James Davis, a retired Army veteran who had settled into civilian life after 2 decades of service. Their 4 children, Aiden, Maya, Ethan, and little Sophia, filled the modest two-story house with noise and laughter, giving the impression of a family that had everything under control. James was respected for his discipline, and Carla was admired for her dedication as a mother, yet beneath that perfect surface lay a web of secrets that no one could have imagined. The family's outward image masked a growing tension that had started months before, an invisible fracture that was threatening to break apart everything they had built. James had returned from his final deployment different, more withdrawn, carrying unspoken burdens. Carla noticed the way he sometimes avoided her gaze or stayed out late without explanation. The children were too young to sense it, but Carla had begun piecing together small details that disturbed her. A misplaced document here, a late-night phone call there, subtle enough to be brushed aside but heavy enough to stir suspicion. She told herself that James was simply adjusting to life outside the army, yet the unease stayed with her. What she didn't know then was that one secret, buried beneath years of silence, was about to rise to the surface in the most brutal way. It began with an ordinary doctor's appointment. James had insisted the entire family undergo a routine health check, claiming it was something he'd been neglecting since retiring. Carla thought nothing of it. They went together, joking about their dislike of needles, reassuring the children as the nurses drew blood. It was supposed to be routine, nothing more than precaution. But days later, Carla's world began to tilt. The results arrived, and in them lay a truth that shattered her perception of her marriage. James's medical report revealed something he had hidden for years: an HIV positive status. Shocked and numb, Carla demanded her own results. The papers she held in her trembling hands confirmed her worst fear. She too had been infected. The devastation of that discovery consumed her. Questions stormed through her mind like a relentless tide. How long had James known? How had he concealed it? And most horrifying of all, had their children been put at risk? Carla found herself spiraling between grief and rage, replaying moments in her marriage when she had trusted him completely, now twisted into evidence of betrayal. She couldn't reconcile the man who tucked their children into bed each night with the man who had condemned her to a life defined by a virus. The betrayal was not just of their vows, but of her body, her future, her trust. While James tried to minimize the revelation, suggesting that they would manage together, Carla's mind had already begun to fracture. She saw not a partner, but an enemy who had destroyed everything sacred in her life. The neighborhood still saw the Davis family as whole, but inside that house, Carla's silence was turning into something darker. She began to dwell on thoughts she had never dared to imagine before. Thoughts that whispered of retribution, of finality, of a way to end the unbearable weight of her secret. What began as heartbreak was slowly transforming into something far more sinister, a seed of violence taking root deep within her. The days following the test results were a blur of silence and heavy tension inside the Davis household. Carla drifted through her routines like a ghost, performing the motions of cooking, cleaning, and tending to the children without truly being present. James attempted to maintain a sense of normalcy, but his forced calm only fueled her suspicion. She would catch him avoiding her eyes when she entered a room, or lingering on his phone late at night, whispering into the receiver. Every small action seemed like further proof that he had deceived her long before the diagnosis, and her mind began to fill in gaps with images of betrayal she could not erase. The weight of knowing her life had been irreversibly altered by his silence grew unbearable. Carla tried to find moments of clarity. She sat in the children's rooms at night, watching them sleep, their innocence a painful reminder of what was at stake. She prayed silently that their blood tests would return clear, though the waiting gnawed at her sanity. Fear for her children's health blended with her fury toward James, creating an emotional storm she could no longer contain. She began keeping a notebook hidden in her dresser drawer, scribbling down thoughts that grew darker with each passing day. At first, there were questions: how could he have done this? How long had he known? But soon, those words evolved into statements of rage, fragmented sentences about justice, about punishment, about ensuring her children never suffered the same fate she had been forced to endure. When the children's test results finally came back, Carla felt an overwhelming wave of relief. All 4 were negative. The fear that had gripped her loosened, but only slightly. Instead of gratitude toward James, she found her anger deepen. He had gambled with their lives, she told herself, and only by sheer luck had they been spared. Every time she looked at him now, she didn't see her husband of 20 years, but the man who had stolen her health and betrayed her trust. James attempted to reason with her, suggesting they could manage the illness together, seek treatment, and move forward. But his calm practicality only made her feel more isolated, as if he couldn't comprehend the depth of her devastation. In public, Carla continued to play the role of devoted wife and mother. At church gatherings, at the grocery store, at school events, she smiled when spoken to and exchanged pleasantries with neighbors. But beneath the surface, she was unraveling. She began researching late into the night, reading about the virus, about women who had been infected by unfaithful partners, about anger that consumed marriages. What she read resonated with her, but instead of comfort, it fueled her sense of victory. She was no longer merely betrayed. She saw herself as destroyed, stripped of choice, condemned to suffer because of one man's lies. Her thoughts grew darker still. She began to imagine scenarios where James was no longer in the picture. At first, these were fleeting, shocking images she forced herself to push away, but soon they returned stronger, more vivid, demanding her attention. She found herself staring at knives in the kitchen longer than necessary, her grip tightening around the handle as if testing its weight. In those moments, the seed that had been planted the day she received her results was sprouting into something she couldn't control. What she did not realize was that these thoughts, though private and unspoken, were beginning to shape her reality, pulling her closer to a line she would soon cross without hesitation. Carla's anger took on a new form as days turned into weeks. It was no longer just simmering frustration. It began to manifest in the way she spoke, the way she moved, and the way she looked at James. Small arguments flared into volcanic eruptions over trivial matters, and the children started to notice. Their once warm and affectionate home had become tense, every meal served with silence or sharp exchanges. James tried to hold the family together, but his attempts at soothing words only seemed to worsen the situation. To Carla, his calmness was arrogance, a sign that he believed she would eventually forgive and forget. But she had no intention of forgiving. Her journal entries grew more detailed. They were no longer just expressions of pain, but carefully constructed scenarios. She imagined life without James, what it would feel like, how much lighter the house would be, how she could raise the children without the shadow of betrayal hanging over her. She also wrote about her children's futures, her fear that one day they might hate her for staying with the man who had destroyed her health. In Carla's mind, she was already becoming the protector, the one who needed to make the ultimate sacrifice to keep her children safe from further harm. At night, Carla's mind replayed the moment she first saw the test results over and over. The letters HIV positive etched into her memory like a curse. She felt trapped, and the more she dwelled on it, the more she convinced herself that James had robbed her of her freedom. His very presence became unbearable. Even the sound of him brushing his teeth or moving about in the kitchen seemed like an intrusion. She began avoiding him, keeping to herself, creating a wall of silence between them that grew thicker with each passing day. The breaking point came one evening when James attempted to apologize yet again. He approached her gently, speaking in soft tones, telling her he never meant for this to happen and that he still loved her. Carla stood rigid, her face a mask of fury, and the words that had been festering inside her burst out. She accused him of being selfish, of lying, of endangering not just her but their children too. The argument escalated until the children cried from their bedrooms, frightened by the shouting. James tried to calm the situation, but for Carla, the sound of his voice only fueled her rage. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat in the dark living room, staring at the family photos that lined the wall. Each smiling image felt like a mockery. A reminder of the life she thought she had, the life she believed James had shattered with his betrayal. Her thoughts drifted toward action. She began researching ways women in the past had taken revenge on unfaithful husbands, scrolling through endless forums and stories that seemed to validate her feelings. While most people read those accounts and moved on, Carla internalized them. They became fuel for her spiraling mind, justification for what she was beginning to plan. As the house slept, Carla stood in the kitchen, the cold light from the refrigerator illuminating her face. She opened a drawer and pulled out a knife, holding it tightly in her hand. For several minutes, she stood frozen, imagining the act, the release, the silence that would follow. Her breath came in shallow bursts, her hands trembling not from fear but from adrenaline. Though she eventually put the knife back, the moment was significant. It was the first time she allowed herself to truly envision what she might one day do. And in her mind, it no longer felt like merit, felt like justice. Carla's world grew darker as she embraced the idea that her pain could only end through destruction. She began to study James in ways she never had before, watching his movements, memorizing his routines, noting when he left the house and when he returned. To him, she appeared cold and detached, a wife slipping further away into depression. But to Carla, it was careful observation. She was collecting details like pieces of a puzzle, shaping them into a plan she was determined to see through. The children were caught in the middle of a storm they couldn't understand. They whispered to each other in their rooms, asking why their mother barely spoke to their father anymore, or why their father seemed constantly on edge. James still tried to keep a sense of normalcy alive, helping with homework, making family dinners, but the warmth was gone. The house that once felt safe and nurturing was now suffocating with unspoken tension. Carla's silence was louder than any shouting, and James could feel it crushing him daily. Inside Carla's mind, however, she was no longer silent. Her thoughts raced endlessly, filled with vivid images of what she considered to be her path to freedom. She convinced herself that James had not just betrayed her, but condemned her. Every time she felt her body ache with exhaustion or thought of the future she might not live to see, she blamed him. She began to believe that removing him wasn't just an act of revenge, but of survival. The twisted logic gave her strength, almost a sense of purpose. Carla's planning grew meticulous. She rehearsed scenarios in her head, what tools she might need, how she would dispose of evidence, even how she would keep the children from discovering what she had done until it was too late to turn back. She became secretive about her internet searches, careful to delete browsing histories. Though at times she wondered if a slip-up might draw attention sooner, almost daring fate to intervene. But fate stayed silent, and her obsession deepened. James, despite his efforts to keep the family together, felt himself unraveling under the weight of guilt. He noticed Carla's growing detachment, but convinced himself that time and patience might heal her. He didn't realize that while he hoped for forgiveness, Carla was already envisioning his absence. Her cold stares, her avoidance of touch, and her late-night wanderings should have alarmed him more than they did. But James clung to denial, blind to the danger closing in. The tension finally reached a point where even the children began to fear their mother. They noticed how often she disappeared into her room, how her eyes lingered too long on the kitchen knives, how her smiles never reached her eyes. Carla thought she was hiding her rage well, but children have instincts sharper than most adults realize. They whispered about how different she was becoming, though they never dared to tell James, afraid of what might happen if they did. One night, while the house slept, Carla sat again in the dim glow of the living room. She held a notebook in her lap, scribbling details furiously. It was no longer just emotional release, it was a manual, a step-by-step outline of what she planned to do. Her handwriting was jagged, her words fueled by obsession. When she closed the notebook and set it aside, she felt a strange calm, as though committing her thoughts to paper made them more real, more possible. The transformation within her was nearly complete. She was no longer a woman grieving betrayal, but someone consumed by the idea of retribution. Each day that passed, her resolve hardened, and in her mind, James's fate was already sealed. Carla's thoughts had crossed the point of no return, and now she began turning ideas into actions. The anger that had once paralyzed her became fuel, pushing her into a state of frightening clarity. She no longer wept at night or questioned why this had happened to her. Instead, she focused on control. She told herself, She had been powerless when James handed her the truth about his betrayal. But now she would seize back that power. Her plan would be her revenge, her way to reclaim the life she believed had been stolen from her. She started by gathering tools under the guise of household chores. A new set of heavy-duty trash bags, cleaning solutions, gloves, and even duct tape found their way into the garage. To anyone else, it would have looked like simple preparation for spring cleaning. But in Carla's mind, each purchase was part of her arsenal. She took satisfaction in how easily she could conceal her intentions, how James never questioned the growing supplies. His blindness reassured her that she was smarter, more prepared, and already a step ahead of him. Her focus then shifted to timing. She observed James carefully, noting the patterns of his work schedule, his phone calls, and his tendency to fall asleep on the couch after long days. She realized that his predictable habits would be his downfall. The children, too, had their routines. School, homework, bedtime. Carla mapped everything out in her head, calculating when the house would be most vulnerable, when she could act without interruption. It became a twisted game of logistics, and she found herself enjoying the meticulous planning, as if it were a challenge only she could master. At the same time, Carla worked on masking her true emotions around James. She forced a softer tone, speaking just enough to keep him from suspecting the storm inside her. She prepared meals, asked about his day, even offered small smiles that seemed genuine. James, weary from guilt and desperate for reconciliation, clung to these crumbs of affection. He believed she was slowly warming again, never realizing he was being lulled into complacency. The more he relaxed, the more Carla was convinced her plan was foolproof. The children remained cautious. However, they still felt something unsettling about their mother's demeanor. She was attentive one moment and distant the next, and her gaze lingered on their father with a sharpness that frightened them. Though they didn't understand what was happening, their instincts screamed that danger was near. Carla noticed their unease, but she no longer cared. She saw them as obstacles, innocent, yes, but in her mind, tied to James's betrayal because they tethered her to him. She told herself that if they got in the way of her freedom, sacrifices would have to be made. One late evening, when James had gone to bed early, Carla crept into the garage and rehearsed what she planned to do. She held the gloves in her hands, ran her fingers along the edge of a blade she had taken from the kitchen, and pictured the moment she would finally act. The images gave her a strange sense of calm, even satisfaction. For the first time in months, she felt in control of her life. By the time she returned inside and stood over James's sleeping form, she no longer saw him as the man she had once loved. She saw only the embodiment of betrayal, the cause of her suffering, and the reason she had lost her future. In her mind, he had already been condemned. All that remained was to choose the night when her thoughts would finally become reality. Carla's obsession had reached a point where every waking moment was consumed by the plan she had built in her mind. Days blended together, and yet she tracked each detail with precision, waiting for the perfect opportunity. Her demeanor toward James remained deceptively calm, even affectionate at times, as though she were trying to rekindle their fragile marriage. She cooked his favorite meals, asked about his work, and let him believe the storm between them was beginning to settle. To James, these gestures were small glimmers of hope. To Carla, they were part of the camouflage that allowed her to sharpen her blade in the shadows without being noticed. The house itself became her stage. She walked through each room, imagining the steps she would take, where she would stand, and how she would clean afterward. In the kitchen, she pictured the counters covered with bleach, wiping away the evidence until no trace remained. In the basement, she considered whether its darkness could conceal things long enough before anyone noticed. Each space became a setting in her twisted imagination, and she rehearsed silently as though preparing for a performance only she could deliver. What unsettled the atmosphere even further was the way Carla had begun to change her presence around the children. 2 neighbors and family friends. She seemed devoted and attentive, often seen driving them to school or cheering them on at activities. But behind closed doors, her warmth would vanish. Her eyes lingered too long, cold and detached, as though she was sizing them up, deciding how their existence fit or didn't fit into the puzzle of her plan. The children could sense it. They didn't know why, but they avoided her whenever they could, whispering among themselves in fear. James noticed their unease, but he chalked it up to tension in the family. He believed time and patience would repair what was broken. He never realized the children's instincts were sounding the alarms he failed to hear. Carla's fixation grew more dangerous when she began documenting her thoughts. She wrote in a private notebook she kept hidden inside the closet, scribbling notes like a strategist outlining a battle plan. Lists of supplies, reminders about timing, and even scenarios of how she would dispose of evidence filled the pages. It was as though she needed to see the plan on paper to reassure herself. It was just fantasy, but an inevitability. The notebook became sacred, a symbol of the new life she imagined. Once James and the children were no longer in the picture. One night, as James slept soundly beside her, Carla lay awake staring at the ceiling. The weight of her decisions pressed heavily on her chest, yet instead of guilt, she felt a sense of clarity. She told herself that betrayal had stripped her of everything she valued: her trust, her dignity, her future. This was not about violence in her mind. It was about balance, about reclaiming what she deserved. That justification numbed the moral barriers that might have stopped her. In her mind, the countdown had already begun. She had tested her tools, rehearsed her steps, and decided on the night. What once seemed like dark imagination now felt like destiny. The family that slept under her roof had no idea that the woman tucking them into bed, serving them meals, and smiling across the dinner table was quietly preparing to destroy them all. The night arrived cloaked in silence, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, as though even the air sensed something was about to fracture. Carla had prepared meticulously for this moment. Every detail had been thought through, every tool placed exactly where she needed it. The house was dim, only the faint hum of the refrigerator breaking the stillness. James had gone to bed early, exhausted from a long shift, while the children slept in their rooms, unaware of the storm about to strike. Carla moved through the house like a shadow, her footsteps measured and deliberate. She slipped into the kitchen first, her hands steady as she retrieved what she had hidden days earlier. The weight of the knife felt familiar, almost comforting, as though it belonged to her in that instant. She paused for a moment, staring at her reflection in the darkened window. The woman staring back looked calm, collected. Not at all like someone on the verge of destroying her own family. With a deep breath, she tightened her grip and made her way toward the bedroom. James stirred slightly as she entered. He mumbled her name, mistaking her presence for a gesture of affection in the middle of the night. For a fleeting second, Carla hesitated, her chest tightening as the memory of their life together flashed before her eyes. Laughter, the years they had built side by side. But those images were quickly poisoned by the betrayal she believed had ruined her, and her hesitation hardened into resolve. She stepped forward, and in a swift, deliberate motion, the silence of the room was broken by the sound of violence that could never be undone. The house seemed to hold its breath afterward. Carla stood frozen, her chest rising and falling as she tried to process the reality of what she had done. Her hands trembled now, slick with the aftermath. Yet there was no turning back. She quickly moved to the adjoining bathroom, rinsing her hands, watching crimson swell down the drain before grabbing the supplies she had staged earlier. Bleach, gloves, and trash bags all laid out like instruments in a performance she had been rehearsing for months. But it wasn't over. In the rooms, down the hall, the children slept peacefully, dreaming without knowing, the danger lurking only steps away. Carla wiped her hands dry, her expression unreadable as she stood in the hallway listening to the faint sound of their breathing. For a long moment, she hovered there, torn between what she had done and what she felt she still needed to do. Her mind raced with conflicting voices, some pleading with her to stop, others urging her forward with the same cold logic that had guided her this far. When she finally moved, it was with the same eerie calm she had shown earlier. She opened the first door quietly, her eyes falling on the small figure curled beneath the blankets. The child stirred, sensing a presence in the room, and Carla froze, her hand tightening around the knife. The weight of her plan pressed down heavier than ever, but her heart pounded with a rhythm she could not ignore. The night stretched endlessly, each decision she made binding her tighter to the darkness she had embraced. There was no longer any room for hesitation. The path she had chosen demanded completion, and Carla, in her mind, believed she was fulfilling what had already been written in her heart. The morning light crept through the blinds, casting sharp beams across a house that no longer held the same life it once did. Neighbors began their routines as usual, unaware that only a few steps away a nightmare had unfolded in silence. It was not until the smell faint at first, began to seep through the walls and into the air. Outside that, suspicions were raised. A concerned call was made to authorities, and soon flashing red and blue lights pierced the calm of the suburban street. Officers approached cautiously, their boots crunching against the gravel, while the door, left slightly ajar, gave them their first hint of the chaos inside. The scene that greeted them was unlike anything they could have prepared for. The house felt frozen in time, yet filled with a lingering tension that hung heavy in the air. In the master bedroom, the signs of struggle were clear, and in the other rooms, the true scale of horror revealed itself. Each discovery confirmed the same reality: an entire family wiped out in a single night. 4 seasoned investigators. It was one of the darkest crime scenes they had encountered. And the brutality spoke not of random violence, but of something deeply personal. Carla was nowhere to be found. The absence of the wife and mother immediately drew suspicion, and her name became the focal point of the investigation. Within hours, her image was broadcast across the city, described as a person of interest. The FBI joined local law enforcement, recognizing the severity of the crime and the disturbing planning that seemed to have gone into it. Every trace of evidence, from fingerprints to the staged cleaning supplies, told the story of a crime that was not spontaneous but meticulously carried out. Investigators pieced together the motives slowly. The DNA test, the revelation of illness, and the obsessive spiral Carla had endured came into focus. Interviews with neighbors painted a picture of a woman who had seemed withdrawn in recent months, her military discipline masking the storm beneath the surface. Friends recalled her speaking cryptically about betrayal, about being poisoned from within, and about wanting control back over her life. These fragments, when combined, gave chilling insight into the mindset that led her to the unthinkable. Her flight after the crime showed the same calculated planning. Surveillance footage placed her at a gas station, several towns away, her expression cold, as though she had already accepted what she had done. The car she drove was later found abandoned near a stretch of woods, but Carla herself had vanished. 4 weeks. The manhunt stretched across state lines, her face appearing on news channels and posters, a chilling reminder that she was out there, carrying the weight of her choices. The community struggled to reconcile what had happened. Vigils were held for James and the children, their photographs framed by candles and flowers, their lives remembered as innocent victims of a darkness no one had seen coming. The tragedy rippled outward, leaving questions that would never fully be answered. How could a mother destroy the very lives she once swore to protect? How could love and trust collapse into something so monstrous? The FBI eventually traced Carla to a small motel on the edge of another city. She had been living quietly, using false names and cash to survive, but her isolation betrayed her. When authorities closed in, she did not resist. Sitting calmly on the bed, she whispered that she had done what she felt had to be done. Words that chilled the room and underscored the finality of her actions. The arrest ended the search, but it could never undo the devastation she had left behind. In the end, the story became more than just a crime. It was a tale of hidden despair, of secrets corroding a family from the inside, and of how even the closest bonds could be shattered by fear and obsession. The case entered the annals of true crime history. A haunting example of how tragedy can grow quietly within the walls of a home, unnoticed until it consumes everything.